Holy shit, that's a huge and pretty card. I built my first PC in 2002 with an AMD Athlon 1400 and a GeForce 3 Ti 200. Ever since then I was heavily interested in PCs and the technology behind, but honestly I can't remember a jump that big in between two generations of GPUs. Today we are having a look at the RTX 4090 for sim racing. The RTX 4090 released a few days ago and is built on TSMC's new 4nm manufacturing process, with the chip having around 76 billion of transistors. You probably have already seen the reviews from Gamers Nexus, Linus, Jay and all the others. If not, pause the video and maybe do that now. I will not go into detail how the card performs in general. This video will be solely focused on sim racing. And since most sim racing titles are really old now, they can't even use all the great new technology like the DLSS3 this card offers, but still the card is amazing even for sim racing. And also it actually is really power efficient, using less power than my 3080 Ti in nearly all scenarios, because it's just too fast and we are CPU bottlenecked in nearly all tests. But we'll get to that later. The system that I'm using for the tests is a Ryzen 7950X cooled by an NZXT Z73 AIO cooler. It's the most powerful CPU for sim racing as of today. This might change in a few days, like this week though, when the 13900K releases, but we'll have a look at that later. The CPU is running a negative 20 points PBO2 curve and a slight overclock of 100 MHz on the boost. Memory is 32 GB of DDR5 running at 6000 MHz. And by the way, I have to emphasize this here again, sim racing titles are heavily dependent on memory speeds. Don't cheap out on the memory. Even though we unboxed the Founders Edition, the RTX 4090 I use in the benchmarks that I'm showing is the Asus TUF without any factory overclock. The card is insanely big, and before buying one I can definitely recommend to check if your case can fit it. I plan to put mine on water once the first blocks release, even though the air cooler on these cards are insanely good. I have not seen the card reach temperatures over 70°C in my tests. The cards I compare to are the RTX 3080 Ti Aorus Master, which is almost as big as the 4090 running a nice factory overclock, and the 3090 TUF in a custom loop. For the testing I decided to skip the 16:9 single screen benchmarks because honestly it makes no sense to get a card like this if you're not using a monitor setup that pushes a lot of pixels. As the only single screen resolution I chose 1440p 32:9 ultra wide with a resolution of 5120 by 1440, which is like 7.3 million pixels, a little less than a standard 4K monitor. And then I also did triple benchmarks for 1080p, 1440p and 4K. For the games I did ACC and iRacing. I also tried to benchmark rFactor 2, but either I'm doing something very wrong or the game is just super CPU limited in the replays. I always saw like 85 FPS whatever I did. We'll start with iRacing, and I wanted to start with the same Long Beach scenario that I used in my CPU review, but for a GPU review it quickly showed that it's kinda useless. Apart from 4K resolution, where the 4090 was like 4 or 5 FPS quicker than all the other cards, all GPUs perform very similar in all resolutions apart from 4K at around 60 FPS with drops in the 30s because the CPU can't keep up. GPU utilization is way below 50% on all GPUs tested, but this is also a highly unrealistic scenario with settings that I would never use, like 60 visible cars. But it makes sense as a CPU stress test, but not so much as a GPU stress test, so we'll skip that one. In general, moments where you see a lot of cars on the track around you are CPU limited scenarios, even with the 7950X, so for the GPU benchmark I chose to avoid these because the GPUs are just bored there sitting at like 20% utilization. So for the first proper tests I chose a hot lap around Road Atlanta that I also used in the CPU benchmark. So the first resolution we're looking at is 1440p ultra wide, 5120 by 1440. And we can see that the RTX 3080 Ti and 3090 are performing very similar, with the average frame rate around 180 FPS, and the RTX 4090 completely destroying the others two with an average of 273 and basically a 1% low FPS that is around the same as the average on the other two cards. If we go to a more realistic scenario, I chose lap 5 of an ESS race around Spa again. Again, 3080 Ti and 3090 are about the same at 229 FPS, and the RTX 4090 being nearly 100 FPS quicker on average at 326 FPS. If we move to triple resolution, we'll start with 1080p, which is 5760 by 1080. And again, we can see the 3080 Ti, which is by the way, overclocked more than my 3090, and the 3090 performed very similar at around 190 FPS on average, and the RTX 4090 in this hot lap scenario around Road Atlanta sitting at 287 FPS. Again, the same picture for Spa, the RTX 3080 Ti at 240 FPS, the RTX 3090 at 247, and the RTX 4090 at 310. Keep in mind, the 4090 is not overclocked. I got the TUF, but I got the non-overclocked version. In these 1080p triple results, the 4090 is CPU limited. The 3000 series cards are not. The 7950X just cannot keep up with so many FPS, especially around Spa. If we move to 1440p triples, we have 7680 by 1440 in resolution. Again, a very similar picture, the 3080 Ti and the 3090 at 145 and 150 FPS on average, and the 4090 being at 150 FPS or 149 on the 1 percentile low score here, and the average is like 221 over 70 FPS more than the other two cards. And the same scenario we can also see in the Spa benchmark with the RTX 3080 Ti at 168, the 3090 actually a little bit slower at 166, and the 4090 destroying both cards at 255 FPS on average. Moving over to the hot lap in 4K triples, which is 11,520 by 2,160. It's actually becoming playable on the 4090 Ti, whereas the 3080 Ti and the 3090 sit at around 90 FPS on average. The 4090 sits at 133 with drops into 102 in the 1% low score. Same thing we see at Spa. The 3000 series at 93 or 94 FPS and the 4090 at 141 with the 1% low score higher than the average on the old cards. Okay, next thing, we'll go to Assetto Corsa Competizione, where we see another big jump in performance. I also included a start scenario here. The 3090 and the 3080 Ti are not CPU limited in this scenario basically, but the 4090 is, so the utilization is around 75–80%. But still, we see a significant advantage for the 4090 at 154 FPS on average, whereas the 3090 is sitting at 116 and the 3080 Ti at 111. I don't know what it is, but especially the starts seem to be more CPU limited than anything else on ACC and on iRacing. If we move to lap 5 of the same race, we can see that the lead of the 4090 is increased because we are now not that CPU limited anymore. And we reach nearly 200 FPS at 199 with a 1% low of 145. The 1% low is 14 FPS higher than the average on the 3090. That's absolutely crazy. 3090 sitting at 131, 3080 Ti at 125 FPS here. Both these benchmarks were 1440p ultra-wide resolution, so the single screen without triple rendering. The graphic preset that I used, by the way, on iRacing is just my standard settings that I use for streaming. I will probably put the settings into the description. And for ACC, I just used the default Epic preset without any DLSS except for the DLSS test we'll show later. If we move to triples, the gap is a little bit smaller than on the ultra-wide, with the 4090 sitting at 119 FPS at the start, whereas the 3090 is 104 and the 3080 Ti is 101 FPS. But again, the lead of the 4090 kind of increases when we get away from the start and removing that CPU bottleneck, with the 4090 sitting at 156 FPS, the 3090 at 120 and the 3080 Ti at 116 on average. If we move over to 1440p triples, we can see the 4090 sitting at 118 FPS and the 3090 and 3080 Ti at around 85 at the race start. And same scenario again, the 3000 series cards at lap 5 are at a little less than 100 FPS on average, whereas the 4090 is over 50% quicker and giving an average frame rate of 155 FPS. Okay, now it gets crazy. 4K on ACC without DLSS. At the race start, 3080 Ti and 3090 are basically unplayable. 34 or 37 FPS, well, unplayable. I mean, console players get like 30 FPS, I think, but still, like, it's bad. And the 4090 is sitting at 58 FPS, which I would say it's playable if you have a G-Sync monitor, but you definitely notice the stuttering, especially with the 1% low FPS dropping into the 40s. Later in the race, it doesn't get much better because we are just like completely GPU bottlenecked here. The CPU is not having a hard time here. So going from the start to lap 5 is not such a big difference here, with the 4090 at 65 FPS and the 3090 at 41, 3080 Ti at 38 on average. Okay, if we have a look at the DLSS performance, I chose a hot lap for this. The 3080 Ti goes from 56 FPS to 68 if we use the DLSS performance mode, which still looks decent on 4K triples. The 3090 sees a gain of 57 to 71. and the 4090 goes from 87 to 114 FPS. I'm not sure if DLSS 3 is being used. I do think it's not being used because it needs to be implemented in the game, but nevertheless, there are some gains, but I probably would say it's not good enough for ACC on 4K triples yet, even with the DLSS enabled. Because especially at starts, at GPU-intensive scenarios, we do see drops into frame rates that are not that playable, I think. Okay, another scenario I had a look at is the power consumption. We chose a realistic 1440p triple scenario here, the same benchmark, ESS race around lap 5. The 4090 is CPU limited in this scenario, so even at the uncapped frame rate that we see in green here, it draws 355 watts of power. The 3080 Ti is maxed out at like 397. But it gets interesting if you actually cap the frame rate at your monitor refresh rate. I mean, it's recommended to go like your refresh rate minus 4 FPS. That's what I heard. So with my TVs being 120 Hz, I capped it at 116 FPS. And now the 4090 is so much more efficient because it's basically bored. It's drawing 203 watts, whereas the 3080 Ti is still using 388 watts. So all the rumors of the 4090 cards being so shit on efficiency and using so much power, it's not really true, at least with old games like iRacing. If we go to 4K triples, the difference is not as big. The 3080 Ti is basically on the limit in both scenarios, but the 4090 is still a little CPU limited, even if you uncap the FPS. That's why it only draws 380 watts. But if you cap it at 116, you can save a little bit with the card drawing 337 watts. So yeah, that's it for the regular gaming benchmarks, but me being a content creator, I also was very interested in the performance of the included encoders. So I fired up another replay. We use a Daytona race. I chose lap 9 because then you don't have the crazy impact from the start and you're not only CPU bottleneck. Because in a CPU bottleneck scenario, if you use the encoders of the GPU, you see less drop than when the frame rate is a bit higher, if that makes any sense. So in this scenario, we had an average frame rate of 154 FPS when no OBS was running. The moment we start OBS and create the capture, we lose a little bit of performance with the card dropping to 149. And then the new OBS 28.1 version basically removed these old presets we had before, like quality, max quality and that stuff. And now we get 7 performance preset that go from P1 to P7, with P7 being the most intensive on resources with the best image quality. So for this test, I chose the P6 and the P7 preset. P6 is the slower one, and in H.264 the performance drops to 143 FPS. The old quality preset on OBS version 28 gave me 142 FPS on average, so I think slower and the quality is probably about the same. And if we go to the slowest setting, P7, we still get 140 FPS. So a drop from 154 to 140 FPS. I think these days nobody really needs a 2PC setup anymore, because let's be honest, you don't really notice a difference of 14 FPS when you're running above your monitor refresh rate anyways. And even then, I don't think anybody would be able to spot a difference between 140 and 154 in a blind comparison. Well, in a blind comparison, that makes no sense, but you get what I mean. And if we look at the 1% lows, there's 4 FPS difference between no streaming and the worst preset here. Another thing I want to mention, I talked about it in my 17950 review that the Ryzen is kind of bad for these situations. But with the latest OBS build and the latest Windows updates, I don't see this crazy drop in performance anymore. As you can see here, these benchmarks were done with the 7950X and there's not a 25% drop in performance. Another thing these 4000 series cards bring is the AV1 encoder. That's a more efficient video codec. If you want to know more about it, watch the video from Epos Vox or just Google it. I don't want to go into detail here. Basically, you get better image quality for less bitrate. And I thought, okay, might be cool, but the difference is so freaking crazy. If we look at this, on the left side, we see an AV1 encoded 4K 60 stream at 6 megabit bitrate, which is like not that much. You can go up to 8K on Twitch. And on the right side, we see a 1080p 60, so a quarter of the resolution at 8 megabit. And if you look closely, I mean, really, pay attention to it. This is just a screenshot because I don't know what the YouTube compression is doing to a video, so I think it's probably better to see in a screenshot. But look at the road texture, where on the H.264, the old regular NVENC, you see all these weird blocks and muddy textures, whereas on the AV1, even at 4K compared to 1080p in a lower bitrate, you get so much more details. And that's not because of the higher resolution, don't get me wrong. If you know how these things work, you know at the same bitrate looks better than 4K 60 typically. But I wanted to just push this to the extreme, like 4K 60 on a lower bitrate compared to 1080p 60 on a higher bitrate. And I think there's a night and day difference. Let me know in the comments down below if you can see it, because like I posted it on Twitter and I was like, oh my god, this is so amazing. And then people were like, yeah, what's the difference? I can't see it. But honestly, I think as a content creator, this is great. And I really hope that Twitch and YouTube will allow AV1 streaming soon. But yeah, I will probably do some more VR benchmarks as well. I ordered a new cable for my HP Reverb 2. Should arrive this week, hopefully. Then I'll figure out how to do benchmarks, but I think Will from Boosted Media said he wanted to do VR benchmarks, so he will probably beat me to that. Check out his channel. But yeah, if you have any other questions regarding all these benchmarks, feel free to join the Discord. Just ping me there and ask. Or leave a comment in the comments down below, and I'll try to make an update video. But that's pretty much it for this one. If you liked the video, if you found it helpful, maybe subscribe to the channel, like the video. We also have the YouTube channel memberships if you want to support the channel even further. But yeah, that's it for this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.